Schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and depression have all been argued to have a genetic basis. Schizophrenia is a condition in which a person loses touch with reality. So symptoms of schizophrenia are paranoid delusions. With bipolar disorder, this is a manic depressive illness. So this is where a person's mood swings from wildly enthusiastic energy to hopelessly dark depression. And with schizophrenia, many studies have confirmed that it tends to run in families. So this means that if one has a schizophrenic parent, the odds of schizophrenia rise dramatically. They also rise even further if one has a fraternal twin with this condition. So because of these correlations, a lot of scientists have concluded that schizophrenia is a genetic disease. However, there are other factors that are playing a role, meaning that genetic predispositions are not the sole direct cause. So for example, in MRI scans, scientists have been able to show clear differences in brain structures of identical twins. The afflicted twin usually has larger fluid-filled ventricles, which suggests that there is brain tissue that's missing. And with twins that have both developed schizophrenia, they also show some signs of brain atrophy or developmental failure. However, in situations where the twins don't have schizophrenia, one develops it and the other doesn't, is puzzling. Because with identical genes, they often give identical instructions to the body for brain development. So this means that something else other than biological effects are playing a role and contributing to a schizophrenic brain development. This is also true for bipolar disorder. So the concordance for bipolar disorder is high, meaning that identical twins are very likely to suffer from this disorder. We do know in a lot of studies that depression has shown to be heavily influenced by the environment. And so with depression, certain people with this disorder are likely to have a particular genetic makeup. And they tend to become depressed when they're exposed to significant stressful life events. So individuals that have a mu opioid receptor gene, which is related to pain perception and the pain of social rejection, have found that people that have this genetic variation tend to be more sensitive to social pain, which is responses to being socially rejected. And so they tend to be more sensitive, and that this social pain is also seen in regions of the brain that generally process physical pain. And so in conclusion, all of these disorders have some sort of genetic basis, but they are also being heavily influenced by the environment. Sexual orientation is another important aspect of personality, and there's some evidence of differences in brain structure, such as part of the brain's anterior hypothalamus between heterosexuals and homosexuals. The hypothalamus is known to be related to sexual behavior, and there is some research showing that the hypothalamus reacts differently to sexual smells in heterosexuals versus homosexuals. And so one can argue that homosexuality has a genetic origin, but you can also argue that there are some environmental influences that could play a role. So for example, biological sexual orientation may grow or mature in certain ways in certain contexts. Homosexual individuals may be surrounded by friends of the same sex during early puberty, or first sexual fantasies and experiences may be sought in the future. And so this is the idea of, again, reinforcement, the interaction between reinforcement and biological influences. An evolutionary perspective may argue why homosexuality would have been selected through evolution, given that homosexuals usually have fewer biological children than heterosexuals. And so if evolution were true, then why didn't tendencies towards homosexuality disappear a long time ago, since there doesn't seem to be much survival value inherent in this tendency? And so one possibility is called kin selection, in which genetic tendencies towards homosexuality depends on the survival of nephews and nieces of homosexuals. So if nieces and nephews of homosexuals are likely to survive, then there is a genetic tendency towards homosexuality, and it's likely to also survive. There hasn't been much support on this research hypothesis, although gay men may be especially altruistic towards their nieces and nephews. There's also the idea of inclusive fitness, which argues that the enhanced fitness of relatives is very important. And it gives us a shift towards population genetics. And so this analysis is shifting attention away from an individual survival and towards the analysis of the whole population. Hormones and experiences can also influence people's sexual orientations. So for example, mothers can have medical conditions or they can be on prescription drugs, which can affect the child in the uterus or in early infancy. There was a study that showed that girls who have a male twin brother did better on a cognitive test of spatial ability than did girls with female co-twins. Males of all ages generally perform better on spatial ability called the mental rotation. And the hormone testosterone during development is suspected to play a role in this. And so it makes sense to a researcher why female fetuses located next to male fetuses in the uterus might have their brains affected in this way. And so many biological bases of personality can result from very early experiences rather than from genes. And so the growth of the brain and the central nervous system is strongly influenced not only by genes, but also the environment, including the hormonal environment. There's also been some evidence showing that mercury poisoning, which is an environmental toxin, can produce changes in personality. Mercury is an environmental toxin that's commonly used in our industry, and it tends to show up in fish that have lived in highly polluted waters. And people that eat contaminated fish with high levels of mercury can start behaving very strangely, and they can suffer cognitive impairments. Heavy metal neurotoxicity, such as lead poisoning, can also impair cognitive function. Lead poisons a child's developing nervous system and can also produce deviant behavior. Personality can also be affected through physical illness, such as Alzheimer's disease and Pick's disease. Alzheimer's disease is an ailment of the brain's cerebral cortex, and usually it gets worse over time with elderly people. The root cause is not known, but as the disease progresses, the person starts to notice alterations in their personality, and they become pretty dramatic. The patients can lose their personality altogether, and this is due to memory loss. And so with memory loss, there starts to become quirks of behavior. With Pick's disease, there's brain deterioration as well, but there is often a dramatic change in a patient's sense of self. In particular, patients with deterioration in their brain's right frontal lobe can change their beliefs and their preferences. Drugs and drug addiction can also affect personality. Some drugs that do affect personality are tranquilizers, sleeping pills, and antidepressants. With people that have cocaine addiction, they often can exhibit symptoms of paranoia, hypersensitivity, nervousness, and depression. There is evidence that cocaine prevents the reabsorption of the neurotransmitter dopamine. So when dopamine concentrations rise after a cocaine hit, the initial effect is an emotional high, but brain activity is disrupted as dopamine levels later crash. So it's likely that some people can have natural or disease-caused defects in their dopamine systems, and these individuals can be more prone to paranoid personalities. Genetic and other biological characteristics can influence the likelihood that we experience certain events, and this can be due to tropisms. Tropisms are these motivational forces that originate in temperamental differences. They can derive from the combination of our genetics or our hormone experiences. And so basically, we have certain innate tendencies that can cause us to seek out or be drawn to or away from certain events. So, for example, people with an innate tendency towards aggression might be more likely to experience divorce. Extroverts might be more likely to experience job changes and other moves. And so certain characteristics of an individual can lead them to be drawn to certain types of experiences and events, which in turn influence their individual responding. Personality can operate through the reactions of others and stereotype endorsements. So, for example, if we have pleasant reactions with others, we're more likely to develop positive self images, which can influence our personality. Unpleasant reactions can cause negative self images, which can also alter our personality. And so these can form from stereotype endorsements. So, take, for example, the physical attractiveness stereotype. This is a common stereotype which assumes that people believe what is beautiful is good. And so what this means is that attractiveness tends to be associated with more positive qualities. And so people tend to believe that more attractive people are more successful, more intelligent, friendlier, and more sociable. And this physical attractiveness stereotype can feed into how people internalize stereotypes. And so when we endorse these stereotypes, we can internalize them and set expectations for ourselves. And this can influence how we react to the world, how we see other people, how we react to other people, which can influence our personality. And so again, personality is partially a result of biology, but it is not a direct effect of genes. It operates through psychosocial factors such as reactions from others. Sociobiology is the study of evolution of animal social behaviors. And so they study sexual fidelity, mating rituals, territorial defenses, and social organization. And they apply these concepts to human aggression, courtship, and family relations. Sociobiologists have been interested in studying the Cinderella effect. This is a phenomenon in which a child in a family is singled out and abused while other children are not. And there's some evidence showing that one's stepchildren are on average treated worse than one's genetic children, and that this difference can't really be easily explained. Sociobiologists would argue that it's natural selection that's causing the Cinderella phenomenon. And natural selection would explain that parents have evolved to give preference and protection to their biological children. Evolutionary psychologists try to stick to the evidence found, but analyses can become invalid if they ignore the tremendous influences of human learning and human culture on human behavior. And so, if relations with stepchildren are more likely to be conflict prone due to evolutionary pressures, this doesn't necessarily mean that loving, wonderful relations with stepchildren don't occur. Darwinism and social Darwinism is the survival of the fittest theory. And the survival of the fittest often led to this assumption that it's a every man for himself attitude, a dog eat dog world. But such an assumption is not implied by evolution, and that's not what the survival of the fittest is proposing. It is proposing that in complex species like primates, what evolves is a capacity for certain types of behavior in certain situations. And whether this behavior occurs really depends on whether it's learned, and patterns of learning are shaped by culture and socially transmitted expectations and knowledge. In many non-human primates, knowledge and habits are often acquired from others. So many animals have communication and social organizational societies. So with the survival of the fittest theory, many tend to assume and misconceptualize survival of the fittest, meaning that the fittest culture reproduces and conquers all others. And so this unfortunate expression, survival of the fittest, is the most misunderstood and misused concept in science. Rather, survival of the fittest means that individuals vary in their capacities for a variety of tendencies, and the ones realized depends on a multitude of interacting forces. Biological issues in personality don't really account for this, and they should be examined in terms of how they are being interpreted for purposes of public policy. The Human Genome Project is an ambitious research effort that's aimed at deciphering the chemical makeup of the entire human genetic code. The primary work of the project is to develop research tools that will allow scientists to identify genes involved in rare and common diseases. So the biologists are trying to work on identifying functions of each of the 20,000 or so genes. And the immediate goal is to develop treatments for inherited diseases, or looking at genes that influence people's tendencies to be aggressive or depressed or have negative traits. A subtle kind of genetic racism can creep into this thinking. The argument is that modern medicine is keeping alive people who otherwise would have died, and therefore survival of the fittest is defunct and the human genetic pool is deteriorating. So therefore, if we were to evolve, we must engage in genetic engineering to fix and preserve the healthy gene pool.